We have four very prominent speakers coming from the region. Mr. Fawaz Tello, Mr. Najib Ghadban, Mariam Hawaja, and Muhammad Marandi, and the response will be by Jonathan Whittle. I'm not going to go into the bios of everybody to save time, they're in the book. Without much further ado, I'm going to ask Fawaz Tello to please start.
Good afternoon. Actually, I have a paper which I have been asked to prepare. It contains a lot of topics, so I write headlines, and it counts about 12 or 13 pages. So I am not going to read it, and I am going to focus on some points, main points, maybe some points should be focused on and will reach that session. It's based not only on analysis, and I tried to put a lot of facts and in a context which will lead anyone for the facts and for the right analysis for what's happening in Syria. And some of this is part of my political experience in the last few years or last few months in the opposition. It starts with talking about Ba'ath. Everybody wants to know asking about the Ba'ath and think that Ba'ath party is ruling and Ba'ath party is responsible for what's happening. Actually, Ba'ath party have been used since 1963 by the officers who had their coup, and they used the Ba'ath party as a tent to cover the real regime, which have been established since the first day on a sectarian basis. I want to give you a fact. In 8 March 1963, we have the coup. In 9th of March, 400 Sunni officers have been dismissed from the army. They count about 20% of the army officers by that time. This have been keep going on till 1982, after the conflict between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Syrian regime. During that time, let's say that the Alawis minority was consist of about 8 to 9% of Syria have been was controlling 90% of the army officers, 90% of the security department, which count now about 150,000 person, and which was ruling every detail in our life in Syria. 90% of that department is Alawis also. So this main two instrument was used by Hafez Assad with the decoration of Ba'ath party to say that Ba'ath is leading. Actually, since Bashar Assad took over, he started also to sectorize the Ba'ath party. It means the main position in the Ba'ath party start to be given to the Alawis, and and when this uprising start, from the first day, the sectarian card have been used widely by the regime and by his supporters to promote them and to use. Actually, he was using the Alawis all the time, like his father was using, for the benefit of the family and the 5% of the Alawis who are getting all the benefits from this regime, while the 95% of them just used to protect this 5% of the Alawis. So when he used it all this time, it results what we have seen, the defect of a prime minister is just appointed by Bashar Assad, defect of many ambassadors, defect of ministers, of the defect of this high level people who used. Okay. This high-level people actually who been raised by Hafez Assad for decades to be a good, يعني, a good people who can just do anything with it. Even those people couldn't understand the huge sectarian promotion by the regime for his alliance. So now after 17 or 15 months, we are talking really about very huge يعني gap between the Sunni and Alawi in Syria. This is a fact. The politician can't hide it. They have been. I will answer some questions. Is there any civil war in Syria? My answer, yes, there is civil war since the first day, but it's civil war by the sectarian regime against the revolutionists. While on the other side, till now, out of 10,000 of demonstrations, 10,000 of slogans and songs and banners and hundreds of statements for many many powers in the revolution. You can't touch one single sectarian word about the revolution, about the future of Syria. So at the first 6 months, the revolution was about it was peaceful for 6 months. It was talking about dignity and freedom. Nobody till now see somebody asking for a Khilafah or Islamic State or something like that, including the Muslim Brotherhood, which I think they have very more advanced experience and in our history than the other branches in other places. Now I will move to talk about two things, about the opposition and about the international community and scenarios which he trying to promote in this area. By the beginning of the revolution, I have been asked many times by many diplomats in Damascus. I left Damascus 7 months ago, 8 months ago, 7 months ago. Who is leading that revolution? Actually, there were no leader for that revolution. By the time we start to have leaders, hundreds of leaders, and by the time those leaders have been replaced because either they have been killed or detained, or somehow they stop to be leader, because there is new powerful leader in each area. So the opposition inside Syria was trying to do something to catch up with what's happening, including me, with some activists like Mr. Najib, who has been opposing the regime since a long time outside of Syria. After months of trial, the SNC have been born in outside, but it was mainly consist of many activists outside. Many of them is freshly became an opponent for the regime, while the opposition inside Syria, SNC means Syrian National Council. The opposition inside Syria have been aware of announcing it was working secretly and individually. We have a small group of opposition inside Syria called National Coordination Committee, have announced themselves because they are trying all the time not to be so clashed with the regime, not to be touched with the red line of the regime. And they used to call them that they are domestic or internal opposition, and this is not accurate. Actually, many opponents inside Syria are still there. They're still fighting in their way, but you can't hear them like somebody like me and Mr. Riyad Saif and other was doing before we left Syria recently. We have also another group called المنبر الديمقراطي, like Democratic Forum, which have been established by Mr. Michel Kilo. Some of them exist out of Syria, some of them exist inside Syria or out of Syria. Actually, they have something in the middle between the SNC and NCC. While we are talking about position, we are talking here about a political opposition which is supposed to be responsible to express the revolution point of view for the world. Unfortunately, all of them was not successful with that, including the SNC. Maybe it's the less worse than the others. While the NCC, for example, have no any kind of support by the regime, by the revolutionists inside. These groups with some independence have been asked many times by the international community to meet together and to have a common point of view about the future of Syria, about a transitional period. Actually, after many tries, before about 2 months or 10 weeks, we have a meeting in Cairo. And finally, we got a common documents which talking exactly about that transitional period, and it was focusing on a political solution in Syria, not a military solution. But this document, unfortunately, had neglected by the international community, he was still saying that we want something in common with the opposition. Now, why? Why is that being neglected by the international community? In Tunisia, meeting of Friend of Syria in March this year, I have been attending there, and Mr. Najib was there also. I was still part of the SNC by that time. I have a meeting with Mr. Fred Hoff, who is the main responsible for the Syrian file in the American administration, a day before the conference. And he told me that they have in their mind that a scenario that give Mr. Farouk Shara or somebody from the regime a mandate from Bashar Assad to negotiate with the opposition to inform a national unity government and to start this transition of election and constitution, etc., I think, with keeping all the institutions of the current regime, including the army and security, without any touch, and to be reformed gradually by the time for a period which will take a years. 1, 2, 3 years, and maybe more. This is according to what I hear from him. Actually, this is exactly what have been proposed next day in that meeting in Tunisia. After a while, Mr. Kofi Annan started his initiative. After a resolution of the National Council, we have a meeting in Istanbul which was supporting that initiative. We have later our meeting in Cairo, which was supporting all the international community initiative, including the Geneva meeting, which I don't agree also with it. And all of this scenario was concentrating about a political solution. Nothing of it was talking about a military intervene. So for those people who is accusing the American administration that is supporting any kind of military intervention, I told them, please, they are not. Go and cooperate with them. They are thinking like Mrs. Phyllis and the other is thinking. They are pro support for a political transition, which means in the core of it, get rid of Bashar Assad because he's become an obstacle, while keeping the core of the regime for a long transitional period under the title that for not having chaos in Syria. Actually, this solution, when we talk about international community, you are talking about many sites I want to define. By the way, a lot of details you can find on my paper, which already exists with the organizers. We are talking about Turkey and Qatar and Saudi and Libya. This is one side. Those people is pro to the Syrian revolution, not from the first day for sure. The first 6 or 7 or 8 months, every part of this of these countries has tried with the regime a lot to get some kind of concessions of beginning of transitional process. And we remember what the Arab League have been, the initiative of the Arab League by that time. So these countries, yes, they are really supporting the Syrian revolution, but they are not supporting it, at least as we want. And yes, there is some kind of some support in very minimum limits have been reached for the Syrian revolution through these countries, but actually this is not was the very effective. For in the other side we have the American and the European, which I told you they prefer solution which keep the core of the regime. What I mean the core of the regime? The core of the regime, it means keep the domination of the state for the Alawi minority, which have been ruling since 49 years. This is the core of that political transition, which will take years of it's something like the Yemeni solution. We have the Russian who think that Bashar Assad should have a real reform inside his regime, and maybe after the time they will not mind to him to resign with dignity after, but keeping also the regime. We have the Iranian who is fully supporting Bashar Assad, and they don't want to have any kind of give him to give any kind of concession. So this is really what's happening on the ground. And by the way, I told you in the morning, the American was fighting against having one bullet is being sent to the Free Syrian Army, and this is the truth. This is not a political point of view. Now, I want to talk about what we start to hear about transitional government, about some military council to be ruled, something like that. I think this international community is just playing around to keep, like I said, the core of the regime. Maybe the Bashar Assad will be sacrificed, but the core of regime will stay. Now, because of the facts on the ground, which was not allowing anymore for any kind of transition, because the gap between so much big, we start to hear somebody talking about the peacekeepers forces. It's something like I called Bosnian solution, which really have divided Bosnia, and with a very weak central government and somehow independence parts. This force, peacekeeper forces, maybe they will enter Syria under the title of protecting the minority or something like that. This is another scenario. I will conclude now with what is the facts is imposing on the ground. We have two scenarios. This is the possibility according to the fact. The first scenario, we have a coup inside the regime, or to get rid of Bashar Assad of any way by the international community, to stop killing. This is our demands. stop killing. It's not negotiation. Before anything, we should talk about stop killing. This is our message for the international community all the time. Stop killing. It's not two sides. There is one side is killing. To get rid of Bashar Assad with any mean, to allow the Alawi and the other side to start a negotiating process with the revolutionists, whom they are not Sunni, or they are maybe the majority of them, but they are not Sunni at last. It's a revolution for freedom and democracy. I think the possibility of this scenario became so small, while the other scenario we have here is the completing what's happening now and the war on the ground. I will assure you, within months, we will get rid of Bashar Assad through our own military means, military means. But I think if the international community was part of that, somehow he can part of any partnership of deciding the future nature of the state of Syria. They can be in the position to give us advices, but otherwise to neglect what's happening inside and keep giving statements. Everybody, nobody will expect that those people will be somehow, I will. Okay, I finished, but I like always to conclude with something I wrote in an introduction of a novel by Colin MacLeod. She is, I think, a writer from Australia or New Zealand. She has wrote a novel called Thornbird in 1977, and that novel has been the bestseller at that time. It says, there is a legend about a bird which sings just once in its life, more sweetly than any other creature on the face of the earth. From the moment it leaves the nest, it searches for a thorn tree and doesn't rest until it has found one. Then, singing among the savage branches, it impales itself upon the longest, sharpest spine. And dying, it rises above its own agony to outcarol the lark and the night angel. One superlative song, worth the price, its life. But the whole world stills to listen, and the God in his heaven smiles. For the best is only bought at a cost of great pain, or so said the legend. Thank you.
Let us thank Mr. Fawaz Cello for setting up the scene about the current state of play in Libya, and he comes from the opposition in Syria. Whenever our next speaker was going to concentrate on where is Syria headed, and his name is Mr. Najib Ghadban.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank AMEC, its director and staff, for the opportunity to speak to you today on what's really emerging as a central topic, Syria. Let me begin by saying I did not pick this title, Where Syria is Headed, because while as an activist I know exactly where it's heading, as an academic I'm terrified to even start to answer this question. So with that, I like to maybe focus on 4 themes. I like to give a context at the beginning, then talk about the militarization of the Syrian revolution, possible scenarios, and end maybe with what's expected of the international community. The context of the Syrian revolution, in fact, I like to focus on 2 aspects, one domestic and one regional. The domestic one is that you have a very authoritarian regime that took over power. In 1963, there was one-party rule, which in fact excluded all other groups. That was consolidated in 1970 with the rise of an army officer by the name of Hafiz al-Assad, who in fact, at the beginning, tried to widen his power base, but eventually was challenged in the late 70s, early 80s, and that led to an earlier conflict between particularly the Muslim Brotherhood at the time and the Assad regime, and ended with the tragic massacre of Hama in 1982. I think this is an important history to understand, because that's repression, a great repression, as was called by Human Rights International, Human Rights Watch, gave the regime a great deal of stability throughout the 80s and 90s, and allowed Assad to be the first Arab regime to institutionalize hereditary republics, in fact, in violation of the Republican principles. This is what our friend Sa'aduddin Ibrahim called the Jumlukiyat. It's a kind of half monarchies, half republics. And I think the regional context here is significant because that set a precedent for the rest of the region. We know that had not been for the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, that this model would be basically followed in all of the republics. We know all of them were actually grooming sons or others, in the case of Ben Ali maybe, to succeed them. So with Bashar coming to power in 2000, there were great hope that he might in fact introduce reform. But 10 years of his rule, he failed to introduce any meaningful reform. I think the significance of this point is that he kind of faced what's known in political science as the king's dilemma. And that is, if he were to introduce any meaningful reform, that would undermine his rule. And without that, he's going to face kind of growing opposition. And that took a while. I think the opposition throughout the 2000s began with the reformist agenda, willing to accept gradual change in Syria, willing to work with the regime, did not demand the removal of Bashar al-Assad. All they wanted is basic demands: release political prisoners, left emergency laws in effect since 1962, and allow pluralism by eliminating that article in the Constitution which makes the Ba'ath as the leading party for the state and society. That, of course, nothing of that was seriously considered by Bashar. The regional context, I think, of the Syrian revolution was when, of course, Bouazizi set himself on fire. He set the whole region on fire. Nobody, as many of the speakers, in fact, mentioned, predicted this is the course of action. This is what's going to happen. In January 2011, I actually hosted a conference at the University of Arkansas in which we debated whether revolution can in fact, just stay far, a little bit far. Okay. From whether a revolution can take place in Syria. And interestingly enough, some of my American colleagues, specialists on Syria, doubted that very much. I remember one of them, Joshua Landis, some of you might follow his writing and blog, stated that Assad was different. Assad was different. But we heard this in Egypt when the revolutionaries took into the square. Mubarak said, well, we're different. We're no Tunisia. When things started in Libya, Gaddafi said, I'm not neither Mubarak nor Ben Ali. I'm not even a president. Otherwise, I would throw my resignation in your faces. Remember that speech? And so when it came to Assad, he said, I'm different. I'm part of the resistance axis. I uphold the rights of the Palestinians. I'm young. I'm not like these old guys. I'm not a US puppet, and so on and so forth. But actually, they were all the same. And I think what makes these movements, uprisings, revolutions, is that even though somebody made the argument early this morning, it's not just a revolt against political dictatorship. It does carry economic and social implications. Because in most of these countries, these elites have monopolized not only political power, but resources. Somebody mentioned, I think Juan mentioned, in the case of Tunisia, the report, the WikiLeaks from the Tunisian embassy about the Ben Alis controlling 50% of the resources. Well, in Syria, there's someone who's a cousin of Bashar al-Assad by the name of Rami Makhlouf, who controls more than that. And so basically, it's really a revolution in the both political, economic, and social sense. So this is something I think is important to start with. The Syrian revolution started peaceful, and then for 6 months, nobody has used any form of violence. And it did start actually with reformist demands. that eventually escalated to call for the removal of the regime. We didn't hear the phrase الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام till later. Early on, they were calling for the same principles, the same demands they had throughout the 2000. Again, left emergency laws, et cetera, et cetera. But when the regime responded, and actually after killing people, their responses came too little, too late. The day they left emergency laws, the next day they killed 122. The next day, so it really didn't have any meaning. So the movement into kind of militarization had happened as a result of several factors. The first of which was the extreme brutality in dealing with a peaceful protest. From day one, the regime used snipers to kill protesters. And if you examine the daily killing never stopped in Syria throughout this revolution, whether it was peaceful or otherwise. Early on, the numbers were between 20 to 30s. They would go to 50, 60 during Fridays because there are more demonstrations on Fridays. Mosques became the place where people gathered to take into the street. So it became actually as a self-defense. And what's interesting, those who decided to carry up weapons, they used the kind of mission was actually to protect the civilian protesters. And then the second factor that added to the militarization was defections from the army, from the armed forces, especially from the general armed forces. And in Syria, I think I should say a word about the structure of the armed forces. It's two types. It's the army that's made up of conscripts and recruited soldiers, and it does reflect the demographics of the country. And then there's the elite units. The elite units are made up mostly of members of the Alawite community. Here we're talking about the Republican Guards, the 4th Division, and the 7 or so mukhabarat agencies. So the defection started to take place among the general army. And again, a lot of these soldiers were killed on the spot for refusing to open fire at their fellow citizens. But eventually, some of them managed to escape and managed to join, and some of them went to Turkey, to the neighboring countries, and some stayed inside. And that kind of gained momentum. I think another factor in this militarization, which, by the way, many of us in the Syrian opposition don't really like. We would have loved to have it, peaceful and clean, like Tunisia and Egypt, because it's that peaceful protest that really gained the Syrian revolution a lot of its gains internationally. And we know the risk of the militarization. Many of us are aware of him. But nobody made that decision, conscious decision, to move into that phase of the struggle. I think there's a factor, and here I think we could have a discussion, and I would love to maybe debate this with many of you, whether in fact a peaceful protest is effective under extreme, brutal regimes like the Assad. Why regimes like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi could never be toppled except by maybe violent means? Well, I think it has to do maybe part of the insight. We could find it in the early writings of even Robert Dahl, who talked about the cost of repression versus the cost of toleration in those regimes. So the continued use of violence and killing in Syria did not allow that kind of room for peaceful protest to continue and to reach its fruition. I think even in the, Phyllis in the morning again talked about the Palestinian intifada, the first one and the second. The first was more peaceful and popular, versus the second one, which was militarized and less popular. I would argue that actually, in order for peaceful protest to be effective, you need some margin of tolerance. And at one point, many of us actually in Syria, before this revolution, wish that we would become like Egypt under Mubarak, or Yemen under Ali Abdullah Saleh, or, well, not so much Ben Ali, because that was more brutal and repressive. But Syria was one of the worst countries when it comes to its authoritarian form. If you take all of the indicators, Freedom House, and so on and so forth. So anyway, it's a fact now. We have an armed revolution. Where is this heading? Well, I think I'm going to present maybe 3 possible scenarios, and then end with what we'd like to see from the international community. One such scenario, which is sometimes advocated by those who are very concerned about the kind of intervention of regional international forces in Syria, talk about prolonged civil war. And I actually don't agree that this is a likely scenario for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that while the regime is trying to mobilize sectarian support for its repression, what we see in Syria is the continued disintegration of its repressive apparatus. The second element, I think, which makes me doubt that, I think the regime has lost all kind of really claim to have any political nature. I mean, it was reduced into its repressive apparatus. It's now really kind of, the Syrian regime is nothing but a killing machine. Just to give you an example, that if most technocrats in this government are giving the chance, I would argue they would defect. A case in point is the prime minister, who was appointed just 2 months before he defected. I had the opportunity to talk to him, and he gave me a sense of how he and his colleagues felt throughout this process. He was a governor before he was appointed to be prime minister, and he said, I was the governor of Latakia, one of the early provinces to have peaceful protests. And he said, I tried sometimes to address the demands of the protesters, and tried, but then you have the head of the political mukhabarat, or the head of the Air Force mukhabarat, or others who would try to undermine my work. So there was an intention to use the repressive method of putting down this revolution. So there was no room for that. And he said, from second day I became a prime minister, I was convinced, after especially they shelled my cousin's house in my hometown, that I must leave. And it took him about 2 months to arrange his defection. They are, of course, report that the vice president disappeared, and then, he might be very soon, defecting, but he's literally under semi-house arrest, and he's watched by 2 loyal colonels to the Assad, preventing him from doing so. The last, I think, reason why this cannot go as for a long time is the fact that, again, there is a growing, and this is kind of, I think, what makes this case is different from others, support for even the armed side of this struggle. One of the reasons, despite the lack of weaponry and ammunition among the revolutionaries, among the defectors, that still they are able to liberate more areas by the day. Now, the figure is between 60 to 70% of Syria outside the control of the regime. This is, again, it's not liberated in the sense, the military sense we know it, but it's true that the army could make an intrusion into an area. They could shell a town. Once they are out, the people take over these areas. So I don't think that scenario is likely. The second scenario is the peaceful solution. And those of us in the opposition, we've supported, as my colleague mentioned, all of these efforts, the Arab League, the United Nations, which of course was, made less effective with the Russian and Chinese vetoes. I think the fact that the General Assembly of the United Nations supported the Arab initiative was 137 countries in favor of peaceful solution, and then led to the Annan mission, was important. Now, all of these peaceful efforts would basically focus on 2 tracks. The first track is to try to encourage the end of killing in Syria. So they demand the Assad regime stop killing, and they demand the same of the other side, pulling out of the troops, releasing political prisoners, allowing demonstrations, etc. That's the first side. But the second side, there should be a political process, which in fact should lead into a transition. In the second Arab League initiative, there was a model which, in light of the Arab revolutions, which kind of advocated a notion of a Yemeni-like model, in which Assad would authorize his powers to his vice president. This is the guy who's trying to escape. Once they mentioned that, we were afraid he would commit suicide, because that's the Syrian way of, feeling depressed. So basically, what happened was the Assad regime turned down all of these efforts. There were observers, Arab observers, then international observers. We know what happened. I think now Al-Akhdar al-Ibrahimi, who's a great diplomat, and we really hope that he had a magic solution, might bring something. I doubt this would go as far. One reason, again, because the international community is divided. And that leads me to my last point. The fact that the international community is divided over Syria has really did a lot of disservice to the Syrian people. and empowered the Syrian regime. Let me elaborate on that. The Assad's friends in the international community have been very supportive of the regime. And here I'm talking about 2 countries, 3 maybe, Iran and Russia. They've been providing continuous support politically, militarily, economically, and for their own reasons. I mean, I'm not gonna get into that. But the other side, which is supposedly the Friends of Syria, now they started in 60-some countries, now they're 107 countries in the last conference in Paris, have not offered as much support, actually, to the Syrian people. Despite all of the rumors you are hearing about the Qataris and the Saudis are sending weapons and money and all of that. They have not stepped up to their responsibility. Inside Syria, at one point, there was a great demand for international intervention under the maybe heading of protecting civilians under international humanitarian law, which is part of the UN. It was embraced in 2005 by both the Security Council and General Assembly of the UN. And of course, the UN could not really pursue that. At this point, Syrians gave up on any possibility of foreign intervention. Many Syrians, majority of Syrians, don't in fact like foreign intervention in their affairs, but now what they're calling is the fact that is calling for the right to defend themselves. And so they could have a basically fair fight, the right for self-defense, which is legitimate. I think the international community, I want to take an issue with something was presented in the previous panel about what my colleague Phyllis said about discourage Russia from giving weapons, etc., and don't arm the other side because this is a formula for prolonged civil war. I think this is really not fair of kind of presenting the issue in that manner, because these countries continue to provide that support. And to start with, the Syrian regime is armed to its teeth. This is the regime that was a national security apparatus. That's all what it was. And these weapons, which consume 60% of the Syrian budget, was basically stocked for years and years and years. So they have weapons without even the support of external powers to go on and continue more killing. So I think in that, just 1 minute. In that sense, I think it's really not fair to do so. The international community could do a lot to help in this situation. One scenario is to go back and support maybe the international efforts along the lines of the Arab League, along the line of even the Geneva Agreement between the United States and Russia, which in fact did talk about transitional government that's acceptable to both sides. I think if there is more will among the countries, including countries like South Africa, there can be a way out. And whatever the scenario for Syria, we are very, very hopeful, in fact, and optimistic that this regime is going to fall. It's for many of us, it's a matter of reducing the cost of change. Thank you.
Our next speaker comes from Bahrain. Her name is Maryam Al-Hawaja, and she will talk to us. Will the Bahrain uprising reach a conclusion? She did suggest to me that you just wanted to sit and talk, but...
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see me over the podium? I'm not wearing my heels today. So I tend to talk very fast, but I'll try to slow down. I tend to talk faster when I'm a bit tired. And they say don't trust a thin cook or an activist who looks like they've slept well. I wanted to start, I'm supposed to be talking today about where Bahrain is headed. But I wanted to give you a very brief overview of why we are where we are today in Bahrain. Because if you don't understand why what is happening, then how can you understand how do we move forward? So very briefly, Bahrain has been seeing uprisings almost every 10 years since the 1920s. The people of Bahrain have had a very prolonged civil movement. They've been demanding democracy and other civil rights and political rights since a very long time ago. Now, of course, there's a very huge difference between the different movements that happened since the 1920s until last year and what actually took place last year. In the 1920s up until 2011, all of the uprisings that Bahrain witnessed were mostly and largely led by religious figures. So in the 1950s, for example, when Bahrain was still a British protectorate, the Sunni and Shia religious leaders came together and decided that they needed to remove the royal family in Bahrain because of the corruption, the violations, the killings, and so on. And so they called it Intifadat al-Hay'a. That was the name of the uprising in Bahrain in the 1950s. Now what happened, of course, was the Bahraini monarchy called on the British. The British entered Bahrain, arrested the heads of that movement, sent the Sunni leaders to St. Helena Island and the Shia leaders to Iraq and Iran. And that's how they stopped the uprising from happening. And so we've seen those kinds of uprisings happening for some time now. Why is what happened in 2011 different? One, it was led by youth, not by leaders, but by people who are known to be leaders. Now these youth, when they came out on the streets, the first thing they said was, we are not political, we are not religious. Our movement has nothing to do with any political group or any religious group. And this was very smart of them. Now Bahrain for the past 10, 15 years has been suffering from systematic marginalization and discrimination against the Shia majority in the country. But when the youth took to the streets, they wanted to make sure that this movement was going to include everyone in society. And so they made sure not to focus their demands on that situation of the systematic marginalization and discrimination. And so what they called for were things that unified the people of Bahrain. And so they called for things like a new constitution. The King of Bahrain, of course, in 2002 unilaterally changed the constitution of '73, which gave people a real parliament. He made himself the head of all authorities and all the different factions of government in the country. He kept his uncle, who's the prime minister for 41 years now, in power. He's the longest reigning prime minister in the history of the world. And he also created a bogus parliament that has no legislative power. Now, in 2001, this very same king had promised that there would be a constitutional monarchy in Bahrain. And people loved him for it. And they gave him 10 years, waiting for him to deliver on those promises. Now, instead, what happened was things turned better for a little while. But then we witnessed the return of systematic torture. We witnessed the return of arbitrary arrests. We witnessed the return of disappearances, of kidnappings. And so people said, wait a minute, these were supposed to be the better days that we were promised. What happened? And that's what led to people coming out. But they didn't come out, as my colleague in Syria was saying about Syria, they didn't come out demanding the fall of the regime. They came out demanding promises that were already made but never delivered. And so it was after February 14, 2011, when the riot police in Bahrain, the riot police, by the way, in Bahrain are mostly made up of non-Bahrainis. The Bahraini regime for the past 10, 15 years has been politically naturalizing tens of thousands of people from abroad, from Yemen and from Syria and from Jordan and from Pakistan mainly, and using them both in the police, the military, the security forces, the intelligence, because the majority Shia in Bahrain are not allowed to work in these different agencies in the country. And the other reason that they bring them is they only politically naturalize Sunnis. And one of the reasons for that is they're trying to change the demographics in the country. So what happened was the first day of the protest, the Bahraini regime made the very same mistake all the other regimes made in what is called the Arab Spring. And I don't like the term Arab Spring because it excludes people who are non-Arab who took part in these revolutions. And also the word spring beautifies something that's very horrific that's going on right now in our countries. But they made the mistake of killing people on the very first day of these protests. And then they killed a second person on the very second day. And people said, wait a minute, if we're taking to the streets to demand reforms, and this regime is willing to kill us for it, then maybe we should change our demands to saying, well, we want a different regime, or we want a different government that's actually not going to kill us for peacefully protesting for reforms. Bahrain per capita actually had the largest peaceful protests in the so-called Arab Spring. Around 50% of the entire population took to the streets. I remember I was with a British journalist during one of the largest protests that happened, which held about 300,000 people in one protest. And the population of Bahrain of citizens is about 600, 700,000 people. That's like saying 5 million Egyptians came out on the streets, right? Or sorry, it's more than that. But anyway, I was sitting with a British journalist who told me, you know, if this same number came out in the UK and demanded the removal of the government, before they reach their destination, the government would be gone. I told him, not here. Wait and see what's going to happen. And within a few weeks of the beginning of the protests in Bahrain, just like you had a military intervention in Libya, you had a military intervention in Bahrain. Except this time, the military intervention in Bahrain was from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from Qatar, under the pretext of the Peninsula Shield of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And they were not coming in to liberate the Bahraini people, much to our surprise. They were coming in to help the Bahraini regime stay in place. And so they cleared out the protests, and a very, very widespread, violent crackdown started. Up till today, we have around almost 100 people killed in Bahrain, which, if we had the same population as Egypt, would amount to more than 11,000 people dead. We have had more than 4,000 people imprisoned, some released, some not. Most of those people imprisoned have been subjected to systematic torture. I mean, just to give you an example, and I'm not using my family's example because they're my family, but because it's very telling of the situation in Bahrain. My father's in prison. He was sentenced to life imprisonment because he's a human rights defender. My sister's in prison. My uncle's in prison. My 2 brothers-in-law were in prison. My cousins were in prison. My aunt's husbands were in prison. And this is the case in most families in Bahrain. It's not something that is unique to my family. Now, very quickly moving on, the Bahraini government, to try and control the streets in Bahrain, what they did is they did what they do best. Since the 1920s, the Bahraini government has been known for labeling. They love doing that. So whenever there's any kind of movement within the streets demanding reforms or change in Bahrain, they will label the opposition in Bahrain with being whatever is perceived as an international threat at that point in the world. So in the very early on in the 1920s, the entire Bahraini opposition was Nasser socialists. And then the entire Bahraini opposition suddenly all turned communist. And then the entire Bahraini opposition suddenly turned Islamic Iranian agents. And now they're all Islamic agents from Iran, as well as being terrorists. And so that's what they did this time. They started labeling the opposition in Bahrain, mind you, 50% of the population, as being Iranian agents. And then they also went further to say that these were terrorists, and that there was an Israeli-American Iranian conspiracy against the royal family in Bahrain, because they hated the royal family in Bahrain. And, you know, it's here, of course, you know, it's a laughable matter. People in Bahrain take this very seriously. There were pro-government supporters.
Can we allow them to speak, please? Some order, thank you.
And people in Bahrain actually, who support the regime, actually held seminars where they had huge banners that said, the US, Israeli, Iranian conspiracy against Bahrain. And they talked about this extensively. So this, yes, like I said, is a laughable matter here, but in Bahrain it's serious. And people believe this. And suddenly half the population became, you know, they became traitors. They started getting fired from their jobs. We had around 4,000 people fired from their jobs just because they took part in the protests. Now, what the Bahraini regime did is they made sure that their crackdown was very sectarian. And for a reason. The reason they went after the majority of people in Bahrain, the Shias, was not because the Shias were the ones who protested. And it wasn't because there were Shia demands. It was because they wanted to make it seem like there was a Sunni-Shia divide. They wanted to make it seem like their problem was with the Shias, not with the Sunnis, so that they could promote that idea that Shiism is linked to Iran and hence where the conspiracy is coming from. And so they demolished more than 30 mosques belonging to the Shia sect. When they arrested people, they would always use very vulgar language, calling people names and so on, according to their sect. If they stopped you at a checkpoint, if you speak with a Shia, in Bahrain we have a Shia accent and a Sunni accent, something that was created after this family took over Bahrain. You know, so they can immediately recognize whether you're Shia or Sunni in Bahrain. So if you're stopped at a checkpoint, you will get beaten or arrested or otherwise if you speak in a Shia accent. And this was, in a way, their message to, you know, the Sunni community in Bahrain that our problems with the Shias don't get involved. And then another thing they did was they would have people from the police in civilian clothing go and attack religious processions that belong to the Shia to try and create sectarian violence. Now, they weren't successful in doing this, and I'm very glad, because the day that I heard, I remember I was in the United States, and I heard that there were civilian-clothed people attacking religious processions in Bahrain. And I said, this is it. This is where the sectarianism is going to break out. And it really made my day when I heard that the Sunni community of that area came out and stood with the Shias and said, we will not allow our Shia brothers to be attacked. And this is when I knew that the Bahraini regime may try to implement a very sectarian agenda within the country in Bahrain. But they were not successful. And they're still trying to promote this. Where they have been successful is in employing 13 PR companies, public relation companies, I don't know how many they are right now, but at one point they had 13 PR companies, which basically promoted that this was a sectarian issue. And you rarely ever read a single article today about Bahrain when there is an article written, because there usually isn't. But when you do read an article written about Bahrain, it always starts with the Shia uprising against the Sunni monarchy. Now, all you have to do is look at the situation in Bahrain to know that it's not a sectarian conflict, because it's about whether you're loyal to the royal family or not. There are Shias today who are ministers and who are ferociously defending the regime in Bahrain. And there are Sunnis who criticize the government in Bahrain and today are in prison and were subjected to torture and military trials. So at the end of the day, it's about whether you're a loyalist or not. It's not about whether you're Sunni or Shia. Now, of course, with the myth of Iran being involved in the protests in Bahrain, the only evidence, quote-unquote evidence, that the Bahraini regime had to show for the Iranian conspiracy in Bahrain was that the Iranian channels were covering what was happening in Bahrain. The government's, the royal families or the regime's own report, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, which was set up by the king and paid for by the king, said that there was absolutely no evidence that Iran was involved in the Bahraini protests. This is the government's own report. And the government's own report documented that there were crimes against humanity committed by the Bahraini regime from February 2011 until November 2011. Now, we've been able to document that the violations that have happened after the documentation of the BICI report are even more than the ones that were documented in the BICI report. But what did the BICI report do? It's somewhat similar to the Sri Lankan case. The government brought a human rights report, and then basically what they did was they said, well, look, we're working on it. This is the first time a king embraces a human rights report that holds him accountable to crimes. Now, what did they do? They used this 500-page report to build up their relationships with the international community again, while they continued to commit the very same violations on a daily basis. This is basically what is happening in Bahrain today. The King of Bahrain, a month after the report came out, was visiting the UK with his son, who has allegations of torture against him. Two of the king's sons, Nasser bin Hamad al-Khalifa and Khalid bin Hamad al-Khalifa, were directly implicated in cases of torture. And so you can see that this situation, thank you, that the situation in Bahrain, I like to call it the inconvenient revolution, because it's inconvenient to the Gulf, it's inconvenient to the Arab world, but it's also very inconvenient to the West. And that's why where you see, a call out for, supporting the Syrian revolution or supporting what is happening in Egypt or otherwise, or Tunisia, for example, you won't see people talking about Bahrain or supporting Bahrain. You won't even see Bahrain mentioned in the media. You haven't even seen the minimum happen in regards to violations committed in Bahrain, which is basically have a special session or a resolution or just talk about Bahrain at the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. But the question is that going to happen? One of my colleagues was talking earlier about how Obama was forced into Libya, that he didn't actually lead the intervention in Libya with NATO. I would love to be introduced to the people who forced him to do that, because we need some tips. Because apparently we're not very able to do the same thing. Anyways, I'd like to conclude here. The situation in Bahrain is still the way it was last year. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed is the coverage of the events in Bahrain. People don't know what's going on in Bahrain. Just a few days ago, a 16-year-old boy was shot with pellets and killed on the streets for protesting. And the Bahraini government called him a terrorist. Al Arabiya channel called him a gunman, because I don't know where we have guns from in Bahrain, but apparently they think we do. Al Jazeera didn't even cover the news, Al Jazeera Arabic, which is usually the case. But what we rely on today is not really governments. I don't really have too much hope that the international governments are going to come to the rescue of Bahrain, because it's not in their benefit. A barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia is far more valuable to Western governments today than the blood of Bahrainis. And so today we're depending on people, on societies, on populations, where their vote matters, to actually come out and tell their governments what's happening in Bahrain is unacceptable. And your double standards in dealing with the different governments in the Middle East and North Africa region is unacceptable. Thank you.
And then call upon Muhammad Marandi to speak about the implications of regime collapse in Syria and regime preservation in Bahrain.
Like everyone else, I'm very honored to be here. South Africa for all of us has always been a very important country. I had the honor of meeting President Mandela when he came to the University of Tehran. As a student, I was at the back of the hall, not that I met him personally, when he came to receive his honorary degree. So this is my first trip here.
Speak a bit clearer, I'm not too sure.
No, I'm not a very good speaker, so I don't know exactly how to do this sort of thing. In fact, I wasn't supposed to be here. A number of people couldn't make it, and I was like the fifth string. Literally. So I just heard about it last week. And rightly so, I'm not an expert. I teach literature at the University of Tehran. And I'm not a thinker or an eminent speaker or anything like that. So I'm not surprised at being given such a role. In any case, I would like to, since there has been a lot of criticism directed towards Iran, I'd like to sort of deviate from what I was supposed to say, the topic that was given to me. Of course, I'm used to it, because over the past 3 years, Iran has only been evil from what I hear in the West. But in any case, some of the criticisms directed, I don't really want to respond to very much in detail. For example, the Shah spared Ayatollah Khomeini, and then whereas the Shah was afraid, and he exiled the person, and tens of thousands of people were killed in Tehran during the revolution itself. Tahrir Square was very fortunate indeed. Also, I think that it's important to note Iran's views on Syria. But before that, I'd also like to say that there's a lot of, I think, very little objective information out there in English. And I really think it would be a good idea, for example, if there was a conference between, for example, the University of Tehran and here, and the organization that is carrying out this conference, where there could be a greater exchange of ideas. For example, earlier on someone said that Ayatollah Khomeini said the Islamic Republic of Iran shouldn't have the word democratic in it, and it's because he said if God says one thing and the people say another, obviously God's right. These two statements were never related to each other. The reason why the word democratic wasn't included was, according to him, Islam is compatible with democracy. Now, you can say he's an evil person, a dictatorship, or so on. That's something else. But that, theoretically, that's not accurate. And obviously, any person, a good Marxist, would say that if everyone believes in capitalism, Marxism is right. So that's true for everyone, more or less. In any case, Iran, with regards to Syria, is opposed to international or Western intervention. Not international, that's another problematic word, because the international community usually means white Europeans. But the Iranian position, for example, and this is consistent with previous Iranian policy, the country that Iran, the regime that Iran despises most, perhaps, was Saddam Hussein's regime. Iran was opposed to the war on Iraq, despite the fact that Iranians suffered from that regime. I was shot, I have shrapnel wounds, and I've survived 2 chemical attacks, thanks to European support for the regime. But Iranians in general, the government and the population were opposed to the invasion, because they believed that the Americans did not have the moral legitimacy to do so. Within the framework of international law, which, by the way, Westerners made for us, is tilted in their advantage, and they are not even willing to work within that framework. And then came Libya. Of course, Iran wasn't the only country. Someone corrected me yesterday. At that time, Yemen, too, was opposed to the war. But all the other regional countries, which once upon a time were allied to him, they supported the invasion. Libya. I'm glad to hear that things are going so well in the country. But the Iranian position is that NATO should not have been involved. While the Iranians dislike the regime, they believe that Western forces are not there for the sake of the Libyan people. And again, the UN Security Council resolution, which the Iranians do not believe the UN Security Council to be morally legitimate, because 5 countries have permanent seats and a right of veto. But in any case, even the laws established by the UN Security Council thrown out the window. NATO bombed with impunity, and no one's answerable. How many people died? No one. All those bombings, no one got killed. No innocent civilians, nothing. No answer. They're not going to answer to anyone. In the case of Syria, which is Bahrain, I'll just mention briefly in that Iran never was involved. If Iran wanted to be involved in Bahrain, it's not very difficult for it. But because it again believed that breaking this barrier where one country overthrows another is not going to end. There'll be a general breakdown of international law. And that is what we are seeing in Syria as well. The Iranians from the very start believed that the Syrian government had killed innocent people in the demonstrations, and they protested to them in private initially. And later on, the Iranians, even though Syria was their ally against Israel and in support for Hamas and Jihad and Hezbollah and so on, the Iranians publicly criticized Syria. And many of you, all of you know better than I am, just a teacher of literature, you all know that criticizing in public is very different from criticizing in private. Even the president, the head of the Supreme National Security Council, the leader of the Speaker of Parliament, all these people at one point or another criticized the Assad government. But when the Iranians saw that the Saudis and others in the region, the way in which they were becoming involved, and the United States, the French, and the British, the Iranians became very concerned. The Iranians do not believe that these countries are serving the interests of the Syrian people. You may disagree with the Iranian position, but that is what the Iranians believe. They believe that the Syrian people are divided. Assad has large amounts of supporters, and he has large amounts of opponents. That's what they believe. They also point to polls carried out, for example, by the BBC, which you can find on the Doha Debates website, which was funded by Qatar, where Assad, despite the fact that the poll was carried out in a very biased way and the methodology was flawed, he had the support of the majority. This was over a year ago. Not that the Iranians say that he's good because someone will say, yes, you support oppression. No, that's not the point. The point is that the sides that are now fighting it out on the streets and killing each other, there is no military solution. People have to sit down and resolve it. One side will say the other is evil, the other side will say the other is evil. But it has to be resolved. Like South Africa. I know South Africa is an immensely flawed country. When I spoke well of Nelson Mandela, a number of people were very critical. I understand all these things. Some are very praiseful, some are very critical. But what I'm saying is that it's better at least than people killing each other. Because when they start killing each other, this will last for 50, 60, 70 years. Their sons and daughters will hate one another. And they will be psychologically damaged like the Iraqi people, like the Libyan people who were beside buildings that were bombed, even those who survived. In any case, the Iranians believe that the United States is not doing it for the sake of Israel because the US has two fundamental principles in this region. It's a very principled country, Israel and oil. And we have to respect them for that in a particular way. The United States, what it is doing, is that it's dragging, and I respect my Syrian friends here. But again, there are Syrians who also feel differently. My own mother-in-law, she comes from a Syrian family. The family lives in Damascus. They're not from any minority. And they are scared, I'm sorry for saying this is ugly, but they're scared to hell of the armed militants. Some of them like Assad, some of them don't, but they don't want the militants. And that's why when these people came into their own neighborhood in Damascus, none of them went to the streets to celebrate during those hours. Everyone was terrified. Rightly or wrongly, you can disagree. You can say that, no, everyone hates Assad. Good, okay. The Iranian position, flawed, hypocritical, evil, because Iranians are evil, is that, look, the only way forward is for internationally supervised elections, where all sides take part. One side says, Assad can't be in it. He has blood on his hands. Well, the other side is going to say the same thing as well. They'll say, you have blood on your hands. Okay, then what? Do we have to wait for another 10,000 people to die for the infrastructure? 10,000 people dying is not as bad as the infrastructure, because indirectly hundreds of thousands of people die when you destroy government ministries in the long run, like Iraq. The Iraq war is an end. The death toll is climbing because the country doesn't have anything anymore. It doesn't have government ministries. The only government ministry that the Americans preserved was exactly the Ministry of Oil. Everything else was destroyed. The whole archive of that country was wrecked. In any case, I'd like to end on a final note, because references are made to sectarianism. Sectarianism is evil. And the answer, again, is free and fair elections. But I want to point this out, and that is that Iran, with all its flaws and evil intentions that some people say it has been the most unsectarian country that I know of. In Bosnia, the Iranians supported Bosnia when no one else did. And it was at a time when the Iranian economy was completely destroyed after the war. Bosnians would know this. In Palestine, the suffering that the Iranians are going through today, embargoes and sanctions where you're not allowed to import rice, medicine. This is Western civilization. Mr. Obama, the humanitarian president who carries out drone attacks everywhere, trying to prevent. They say this is exempt and that is exempt. When you shut down the central bank, that's like shutting the bank in your neighborhood. He's just as evil as Bush, if not more hypocritical. But the suffering that the Iranian people have gone through over the past 3 decades is because of Palestine. Do you think that if Iran went silent on Palestine, we would have these difficulties? Do you think it has anything to do with the Iranian nuclear program? The reality is that the Iranians believe, even though the Iranians know the suffering that they have to, some may say, well, the Iranian position on Palestine is hypocritical. Well, I know Iran is always hypocritical. That's what I hear. That's what I've been hearing for 3 decades. But hypocritical or not, I think that the only solution is for countries like South Africa to find a way to move away from the Western hegemony and independently find a solution where the people of Syria can sit down, resolve their problems, and live peacefully together in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad. I now want to call upon Jonathan Whittle. And part of being a diplomat is protecting South African citizens wherever they go. Jonathan works for Doctors Without Borders, and sometimes he comes to Libya and I have to find protection for him, or he has to find protection for me. Jonathan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for all of your assistance, Ambassador, in all the tricky places I find myself. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. What I want to do is to respond to the panel briefly, but drawing on my own experiences, having worked in Syria recently, in Libya, which I won't really refer to, but and in Bahrain at the beginning of the uprising in February, March of last year. what I've heard from the panels before me, and I thank each one of them for a very interesting contributions, is, and excuse me for the medical analogy, I work for Doctors Without Borders, but I've heard diagnoses, various diagnoses of the problems that we face in Syria and Bahrain. I feel like the diagnosis of Bahrain is quite a simple one in comparison to the diagnosis on Syria. And in a way, it's slightly unfair that they're both in the same panel. Thank you. But what I think is fair to say is that in both contexts, and whether this is a reflection of reality or imposed reality, there is an extreme polarization. One of the previous panelists from the previous session referred to in Syria the 4 various conflicts that are taking place in Syria at the same time. And on these different levels, we see continuing, we see reflected at the 4 different levels rather, this polarization. Now, what I was encouraged with the panel before me is possibly that there's not that the solution that seems to arise, and it seems like a very simple one, and if we know how to do this, I'm sure we wouldn't all be sitting here, but a need to rise above the polarization, the need to transcend the polarization, and to find a solution that is somewhat inclusive. What I find interesting about that is the parallel, possibly, with the medical work that Doctors Without Borders and that I've been doing in Bahrain and Syria, where just as there's a need for a political solution that transcends polarization, Doctors Without Borders, what we've been trying to do is to find a medical solution that transcends polarization, that can provide treatment to everyone, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their religious, sectarian affiliation. Because at the end of the day, and I think something that we can all agree on as a panel, is that the crises in both Bahrain and Syria affect all Bahrainis and all Syrians. And this is something that is absolutely clear. Now, if I can use another medical analogy, if we've looked at the diagnoses up to now, what about the symptoms? Because the title of this panel is Unfinished Business. These crises are continuing. They haven't ended. We have a long way to go potentially in both Bahrain and Syria. I can talk about my own personal experience of what some of the symptoms are of this polarization, and it's by no means the only symptom. But what we faced as Doctors Without Borders is severe challenges in access. And when I say access, I'm not only talking about patients' access to health facilities, but also health workers' access to patients. And I think this is it's a small example, but it represents a much deeper problem of the polarization that we're seeing in both Bahrain and Syria. For example, in Bahrain, if we look at access to healthcare for patients, the polarization within Bahrain results in a situation where if you are wounded in Bahrain today in protests, you have no access to healthcare. By accessing healthcare, health facilities are used by the government in Bahrain as bait to capture and arrest patients that have been involved, people that have been involved in the uprisings. Many of them are wounded with birdshot injuries, and those birdshot injuries are used similarly to how they were used during apartheid South Africa as markers to identify people that have been involved in protests and as a way to identify who needs to be arrested and detained. In Syria, we've seen health facilities actively targeted, health facilities shelled. By whom? We have seen, certainly in the case of Homs, we have seen regime forces targeting health facilities, but not exclusively, I have to say. And this is something as well that I think is important to acknowledge, that there are not only problems of respect for health facilities from the side of the regime, but this is also an issue of not an equal battle. So absolutely the regime forces have a huge and a disproportionate responsibility for this targeting. In both Bahrain and Syria, we've seen doctors, health workers arrested and tortured. So access to health facilities is extremely complex, and the result of this and the impact of this polarization is that a health capacity starts to develop on both sides of the divide. And we see health facilities being established on the side of the opposition, and we see health facilities being maintained in government-controlled areas on the side of the government. And this is something where, concretely and medically, there is massive problems of quality. I've seen surgeries being conducted in homes on kitchen tables where injuries are being addressed by doctors doing their best under the circumstances. So this developments, and why I'm telling this story is that the development of medical capacity on both sides of the divide is not a solution in terms of patients' access to healthcare. And I feel that this is something that potentially is reflected in the political discussion that we have today, where the polarized debate is not necessarily in the interests of an inclusive solution to both the problems of Bahrain and Syria. Now, if we look at access for health workers to health facilities, and this will be my last point, sorry, health workers to wounded, we see massive constraints in access. For Doctors Without Borders, we are unable to access Syria officially today, and we've been kicked out of Bahrain. Personally, I've been accused of being an agent of Iran in Bahrain, and in Syria, I doubt I would have a similar, similar reputation. So we're drawn into, unwillingly, the polarized debate. We're unable to officially access Syria. We have, and we've informed everyone very transparently, health facilities currently in the north of Syria where we're providing treatment to the wounded. These health facilities are considered by the Syrian government to be illegal. Now, part of the challenge of this problem is the hangover from Libya, which some of the discussants have mentioned in previous talks and from the floor. Humanitarian intervention and the use of the terminology humanitarian intervention by the humanitarian President Obama, who's won a Nobel Peace Prize for conducting just wars, is something that we strongly and undeniably condemn. The use of humanitarian terminology undermines organizations like Doctors Without Borders' ability to independently access these environments, because we are by fate or whatever, we are associated with the same kind of intervention that is propagated by Western imperial forces. And this is something that is an extreme problem that we faced throughout the uprisings of the Middle East and North Africa, despite the fact that as Doctors Without Borders, we accept no funding from governments for any of our work in conflict settings, least of all the American government. Now, in conclusion, and I will stop. I see the ominous note coming. The result of this that I've tried to map out is what I would term a politics of exclusion. We see it in our work as medical providers. We see patients excluded from the possibility to access healthcare. And it's this politics of exclusion that certainly needs to be addressed at a medical level, and which is what we try to do as Doctors Without Borders, to provide a medical solution that transcends polarization, that transcends political affiliation, religious affiliation, and is a safe space where anyone can come to receive treatment, regardless of whether they're fighters, civilians, pro-Assad, anti-Assad, Alawite, Shia, Sunni, regardless of the labels and identities that might be imposed on people. What I see as the possibility, and what I hear from the panel, is the possible need for a political solution that reflects a similar goal, one of inclusiveness that transcends this polarization. Thank you very much.